Won't it be nice when that song comes to fruition? When we all get to be home and we no longer have to bear the burdens and the sadness of this world, for it is an often burdensome and frequently sad world in which we live. I think and perhaps this isn't true in your own life, so I may be speaking for myself, but perhaps one of the great underrated things about heaven, if we can think of it in those terms, is going to be the lack of sin and temptation. Near the end of the book of Revelation, there's a statement made in this description of the new heavens and the new earth, the new Jerusalem. In this context of Revelation 21, something that I really like there, beginning in verse 25. And Revelation 21 and verse 25 says, "And in the daytime, for there shall be no night there, its gates shall never be closed. And they shall bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it, and nothing unclean and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life." You know what I look forward to about heaven is heaven is going to be an existence without the same temptations that we bear here, without any temptations at all, for there is no sin in heaven. You're going to finally, for all eternity, be able to let your guard down. You don't have to fight that battle anymore. You don't have to watch out for that temptation. You don't have to have passwords on everything and accountability partners keeping an eye out for you and guilt around every turn. That's going to be really, really nice in heaven. But until then, here we are. And we bear those burdens, and we face those trials, and we have to come to terms with the temptations in our lives. Now, one way that some people try to deal with the temptations in their lives is, as young people, they say, well, I'm just going to sow my wild oats. And that's how I'm going to deal with my temptations, is just sow my wild oats. Have you heard that phrase before? I don't know if the young people still use that phrase anymore. I'm too old now to be in touch with what the young people say anymore. But the idea of sowing your wild oats is, as a young person, go ahead and sin to your heart's content. Just get it out of your system. And if you just get it out of your system as a young man, as a young woman, you're not going to want to do it then for the rest of your life. Because you'll look back and go, oh, I tried it. I was there. I did all the drinking and all the partying and all the fun. And now I can just kind of grow up and be a mature adult from this point onward. A few weeks ago, my family and I went on a little day trip. There's a large and thriving Amish community in Middle Tennessee, about 3.5 hours or so from where we live in Northwest Mississippi. I know, I tell people I live in Memphis. I really live in Northwest Mississippi. Nobody knows where Olive Branch, Mississippi is, so I just tell them Memphis. Point being, we went on a day trip out there to Amish country. If you've never been to Amish country, it is a really interesting experience. Those people sure know how to make jams and jellies and sourdough bread, and we came home with a lot of stuff. But you learn a lot about the Amish while you're there, just by the way they live. One thing about the Amish is when they're young, they are allowed a couple years of sowing their wild oats, and their parents turn a blind eye to it. In fact, their parents tell them, go off into the world. Go ahead. Go learn the ways of the English, because we're all English to the Amish, right? That's what they call non-Amish peoples, the English. Go out, live in the English world. Go see what it has to offer and get it out of your system. And when you're all done, you can come on home and we'll meet the local bishop and we'll confirm you and you'll be officially a part of the Amish community. And they believe that just kind of letting them go out there and sowing their wild oats is going to effectively and efficiently get the English ways out of their system. Now, this lesson is not about the Amish, and I'm not going to offer a whole lot of commentary on the way the Amish live. I'll let you do your own research on that. It is certainly an eye-opening lifestyle, to be sure. But I wonder, is there wisdom to this idea of sowing your wild oats? Can you justify prodigal living now as a young person on the basis that it will pay dividends later in a greater level of maturity and self-control and perspective when you become an adult? Now, on the subject of sowing wild oats as a young man, especially in the context of marriage, one writer in a book called Good Homes in a Wicked World, this is the writer named Irvin Lee, he writes the following, follow along if you will. The devil himself is the author of the idea that a young man must sow his wild oats. The Bible teaches a very different thing. The youth who thinks that drunkenness, fornication, and other forms of ungodliness are the smart things to do in order to have a good time and to be popular with the crowd is not likely to find himself happily married when he is an adult. Such a young man is actually destroying all hope of a happy marriage. God, and listen to this point here, God knows what is best for us at every age of our lives. And He never recommends ungodly behavior at any time. Can we be clear about that? That the Bible at no point, for any age, for anybody, recommends or prescribes sinful behavior with God's approval. In fact, the very opposite is true. A passage that we're all very familiar with, I'm sure, if you go to the book of Psalms and notice Psalm 119, the longest of all the Psalms, and we sing songs with these very lyrics. In verse 9 of Psalm 119, the writer says, "How can a young man keep his way pure?" What's the answer? How can a young man keep his way pure? By purging himself of all the evil, by sowing his wild oats as a young man. Is that what the writer of Psalm 119 says? Does he prescribe purity in the young man's life by, you just got to get it out of your system. Just do it all now, hit the gas pedal, drive as fast as possible, eat what you want, drink what you want, sleep with whoever you want, and then, you'll see later on when you finally wise up and become a grown-up, and you'll settle down and, your hair will recede and you'll work a boring job. And is that what Psalm 119 says? How can a young man keep his way pure? By keeping it according to thy word. That is the call to purity for us. Now, there's another Old Testament passage that I want to spend some time looking at here. If you turn your Bibles now to Ecclesiastes. And I want to ponder Ecclesiastes chapter 11 going into chapter 12. So we'll kind of cover our bases here and go from the end of chapter 11 into chapter 12. And I want to read the entire passage right now, and then we're going to go back and take a look at it verse by verse and make some application here. So follow along with me in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, picking up, and let's start in verse 7 for context, and we'll go on into chapter 12. Ecclesiastes 11, beginning in verse 7. The light is pleasant, and it is good for the eyes to see the sun. Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all, and let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. Everything that is to come will be futility. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of your young manhood. Follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes, yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all of these things. So verse 10 says, remove vexation from your heart, put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. And going into chapter 12, he goes on, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them. And if you ever want to feel really down about your future, keep reading in chapter 12. I don't know if you've ever read the book of Ecclesiastes. Maybe you're not super familiar with the Bible. Maybe you're new to it and you're visiting here for the first time. Ecclesiastes was written by a very, very, very rich, smart man about all the regrets that he had about the vain, pointless life that he led because he kept God at arm's length. He thought, maybe my wealth will make me happy. Maybe my wisdom will make me happy. Maybe I can find some purpose and point to this life under the sun, right? Kind of like, let's table God. Life under the sun, is it worth living? And his conclusion was, it's vain. It's an empty kind of life. And chapter 12 is all about the end of that life. In very poetic language, he takes symbols and analogies and describes the way we all have to face our old age and our eventual demise. And he talks about the way that the body degrades. Your teeth fall out. Your bones become weak. You're not the strong and vigorous man that you once were. People lead you by the hand and pat you on the head and treat you treat you like a child. And he says, that's the end of all of us. And then we die, and the soul goes back to God for judgment, and the body returns to the earth and becomes dust again. And that's kind of what we have to face, isn't it? So come forward as we stand and sing. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11, he gives some very sage advice to the young man, which kind of gets more to the point of this lesson. Let's go back and look at a couple of these things here, and let's make some application together. In verse 8 of chapter 11, he makes this statement, "Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all. Let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. Everything that is to come will be futility." Having lived a long life and having seen and done just about everything that his resources could allow, Solomon, the presumed writer of Ecclesiastes, now makes it clear that it is better to dwell on the good days than to be darkened by the bad days. And I like how there's no false advertisement here. He says, there's going to be dark days and they will be many. They're going to be many. And if you feel like it, if you feel like being depressed and dwelling on the bad days, this world always gives you plenty of reasons to dwell on the bad days. Like there's always something. Like even if you're healthy and wealthy and nothing's wrong in your life like Solomon was, I mean, there's plenty of points in Solomon's life where if he wanted to dwell on the bad, he could have dwelt on the bad. So you've got a choice now as a young person, a young man, young woman, you've got a choice now. Life is not always going to be easy for you. And you can get depressed about it and say, man, as soon as I'm out of my parents' house, I guess the gravy train is over. Do the young people say gravy train anymore? No? Okay, all right. Sorry about that. You'll look that one up on the Wikipedia, okay? But it's like, as soon as I get in my parents' house, you mean I don't just get everything handed to me anymore, and I've got to start paying my taxes, and I'm going to have to pay electric bills? And what, Mom, Dad, how much was our electric bill this? $300? Like there's teenagers that don't earn $300 in a month at their part-time job at Smoothie King or something, and that's going to be your electric bill someday. Yeah, if you want to, you could waste all your days being dark and depressed about how awful this world can be sometimes. And Solomon says, I'm not going to advertise falsely here. The days of darkness, there'll be many. And you're going to look at your life a lot of times and see a lot of futility. And if you want to dwell on the futility, that's your choice. Instead, he says in verse 9, I recommend that you rejoice. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood. Rejoice. Let your heart be pleasant during the days of your young manhood. Solomon encourages youths to enjoy it while they can, because days will come when old age and illness will take over. And we get that same idea from Proverbs 15 and verse 13. Take a look at Proverbs 15 verse 13. It says, a joyful heart makes a cheerful face. But there's a warning, though, that needs to accompany the exhortation of youthfulness and enjoying that life. The preacher here in Ecclesiastes continues in verse 9, and follow the impulses of your heart, follow the desires of your eyes, yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all of these things. Now, you might read that verse, and at first you're thinking, so it says it right there. He says, do whatever you want. Ecclesiastes says, go ahead, follow the impulses, follow the desires of your eyes, do anything you want. Isn't Ecclesiastes 11 actually teaching sowing your wild oats? Well, not if you don't finish the verse. That's the amazing thing. The Bible is often its own best commentary, and usually the Bible answers your questions that you have if you just keep reading. Yeah, you could isolate, you could kind of pull that passage out and say, it says it right there, young people, follow the impulses, follow the desires, do whatever you want. But then you keep reading, and God's going to bring you to judgment for all of these things. So here's the way I would explain this verse. Rather than giving permission to just do whatever you feel like, I think Solomon is saying there are plenty of things you can do that are wonderful and enjoyable and beautiful and amazing that will not incur God's wrath. He's not saying do whatever you want. He's saying do whatever you want as long as God's judgment is brought into the equation. You can't just do anything you want. Like, you can't just show up at a car dealership and say, I'm going to pick any car that I want. And I want this, and this. I'm going to go ahead and have the Mustang GT California Special with all the trim and the extra this and that. No, you actually have to account for, do you have the money to pay for that car? That's kind of what Solomon is saying is, yeah, follow the impulses of your heart. Follow the desires of your eyes. But part of that math equation has to include the fact that you're going to be judged by God. You have to include that in the math equation. And I always challenge young people also on this notion that being a religious person, being a faithful person, being a holy person, there's this notion that, like, if you are a Christian, you're like depriving yourself of the most fun things that this world has to offer. I think that's a total lie. That is an absolute lie. Going back to Genesis 3, which we've done several times. We did it yesterday. I'll talk about it again tonight. Satan came to Eve and said, you're missing out. God's keeping you from something. God says if you eat that fruit, you'll die. He's lying to you. God's actually keeping you from that divine knowledge. He's holding you back. And in the process of eating that fruit and gaining that knowledge, what actually happened to Adam and Eve? They lost everything. I mean, in terms of being in the Garden of Eden in God's presence and not being ashamed in their nakedness, they lost everything because it was a lie. And so Satan says, if you become a Christian, you're not going to have the same fun that you used to have. If you become a Christian, you're going to have very boring Friday nights. All your friends are going to be out there having fun and playing, and you're going to be at home with mom and dad playing Scrabble. Is that really the future that you want for yourself? If you become a Christian, you follow that holy living that's prescribed by mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and the elders at church, you're going to miss out. No, I think Solomon is saying the exact opposite of that. Follow the impulses, follow the desires with God's judgment in mind, and you will never have a boring life. I think there is plenty in this world to keep us occupied and busy and in awe without the sin. There is plenty out there to do. There is, and not just talking religious things also. I'm not just talking about work in the church and the things that we need to do as Christians. I'm just saying, like, you don't have to sin to learn to play a musical instrument. You don't have to sin to travel and see amazing things. You don't have to sin to find people like you who share your principles and to do amazing things with them. You don't have to sin to pursue athletic things and achievements in that way. You don't have to sin to do a lot of things in this world that are really, really neat. So don't buy into that lie when Satan whispers into your ears. And unfortunately, a lot of young people tend to use their eyes and their bodies in determining the course of their life. So Solomon basically says, if you don't believe this, O young men, if you don't believe this, and you follow the course of the world, and you follow the ways of your eyes and the impulses that your body drives you toward, you will find yourself living a vain life, just as I have experienced in my own life. Know that God will bring you to judgment for all of these things. And I think the verse 10 also adds to that. So remove vexation from your heart, put away pain from your body. Isn't that a prescription to holy living? There is a certain kind of fun that's fun right now, but you're sure going to regret it tomorrow. There's another kind of fun that's fun right now that comes with no guilt. And verse 10 is saying, yeah, have fun, follow your eyes, follow the desires, do what you want with this life. But remember, God is going to judge you, so don't do things that you're going to regret tomorrow. Don't live in a way that's going to cause you vexation in the long run. Don't live in a way that's going to harm your body. He says, put away pain from your body. Don't do the things that damage your liver, damage your kidneys, damage your lungs. Don't do the things that are going to hamper you physically for the rest of your life. And we could get blunt if you want to. We could get detailed if you want to. I'm not going to spend this time in a setting doing that. But we're all aware, and we're not ignorant of the fact that many, many sins come with a hefty physical price tag. And some of those prices, some of the costs of sin, the small print that Satan doesn't tell you about, will stick with you for the rest of your life. And, in all likelihood, shorten the length of your life. So Solomon says, yeah, live, be young, rejoice in it. But remove the vexation. Remove the pain. Because childhood and the prime of life are so fleeting. They're so fleeting. And you're either going to look back and go, that was a childhood well spent. That was an adolescence well spent. That childhood of mine set me up for a rich spiritual life ahead of me. Or you're going to get to adulthood and go, man, all the stupid things I did as a kid really set me back. And it has taken me a long time as an adult to find my footing. So going into chapter 12, he offers this final recommendation. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. In the pulpit commentary, the writer said, set God always before your eyes from your earliest days. Think about who made you and what you were made for. Not for pleasing yourself, not to gratify your passions, which are now so strong, but that you might use your powers and your energy in accordance with the laws of being a creature of God's making. There is a great proverb that I always try to remind myself of. In Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 29. Proverbs 20 and verse 29. Look what he says here. The glory of young men is their strength, and the honor of old men is their gray hair. You're valuable on both ends of that spectrum, okay? I mean, young people are very, very valuable as young people. Our elders and our elder members are valuable for what they are as well, and what they contribute and what they have to offer. You're both valuable. But those two things don't typically cross, right, in your life at the same time. Okay, the glory of young men is their strength. That strength won't last, so use it well right now. And the honor of old men is their gray hair, but that only comes with time and experience. Maybe a little just for men. It was a joke. I do not use just for men, just to be clear. This is all well earned. But you only have that one time in your life where you're going to be that young and that energetic and that physically capable. So use it well. Use it right. If the glory of young men is their strength, then you better use your strength for that glory. Glorify God. Glorify God. What a shame that so many young people waste their energy on worldly things, and it's only often in a man's old age that he finally comes to realize what the benefits are of serving and loving God. A youth with all the vitality and enthusiasm that comes with it is such an invaluable tool in the service of God. I will tell you this, we need you. We need you. This church needs you. You're not sitting on the sidelines waiting to become useful later. This church needs every kid, every teenager, every young man, every young woman, every young married couple. This church needs you. Please don't waste this amazing opportunity And then look back decades later and go, if only as a young person I had seized the opportunities before me, if I had been more eager to learn, more eager to serve, more eager to set myself up for years of service to God. Because once you set a habit, and once you set a precedent, it's really hard to change it later on in life. If you're young and you don't serve, and you sit on the sidelines in your faith, you think magically at 35 or 40 or 50 that you're all of a sudden, the light's going to click and you're going to go, okay, now I'm old enough to be useful to God. What do I do? You think it's just going to suddenly happen? If you don't start being useful now in the way that you can be useful as young people, it's going to be very, very hard to change that habit later on and figure out what your place is in God's field of service. And I'll tell you what, the worst part of it all is to think about the future. And I'm not an old man. I'm not pretending I'm an old man or anything like that. But I'm old enough at this point where I think I've got enough experience, 20 years preaching or so, to kind of see the writing on the wall in a lot of churches. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to look around at many churches in this world and go, let's see, where's all the young people? And where is this church going to be in about 15 years? You don't have to be a genius. I mean, it's just a matter of looking around the room, isn't it? Boy, we need you. Kids, we need you so badly. And God needs you so badly. And don't wait until you're so old that you just become jaded about a wasted life. In 2 Samuel 19, verse 35, there's a man named Barzillai who makes an interesting comment on his own age. He says, I am now 80 years old. Can I distinguish between good and bad? Can your servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Or can I hear any more the voice of singing men and women? Don't wait until that moment to find out where you need to serve God. Well, let's move on from Ecclesiastes and get to really the heart of the lesson. The real question that we're asking ourselves is, can't I just get sin out of my system? If I sow my wild oats, do some stuff now, get it over with, and then I'll know. I'll know. I'll know that you can't live that way. You can't eat that. You know what your limits are. Isn't there some merit or some wisdom to getting the sin out of my system? The problem in all of this is that the individual who makes that argument forgets that all sins have consequences. It's not just the sin itself. It's the consequence that follows after the sin. I mean, I probably could murder someone and figure out pretty quickly, I really don't want to murder anyone. That was a really unpleasant experience, strangling a man to death. It's not the murder itself that is the problem. Well, it is the problem. I don't strangle people, I promise. It's the consequence that comes behind it. It's the wake that follows the boat. It's the burn that comes after the match has been lit. I'm just going to get sin out of my system. Okay, I guess if that works, but what about the 20-year prison sentence that comes with that? I'm going to get sin out of my system. Okay, well, what about the sexually transmitted disease that's going to follow you for the rest of your life? I'm just going to sin out of my system. Okay, well, what about that night that you got drunk and you accidentally ran over a kid on the sidewalk and he's dead and your life is never going to be the same? I'm just going to get sin out of my system. Okay, I guess that's fine. But what are you going to do about the consequence that follows that for the rest of your life? The decisions that we make now aren't just isolated little decisions. They're not little pockets of our life. They spill over. They impact everything. The analogy that I use about sin is, imagine if you have a cotton t-shirt on, okay? You've got a cotton t-shirt and you take the bottom of it, hold it out like this. And I pour 5 gallons of water into the cotton t-shirt. Does that cotton t-shirt hold the water at all? No. It just soaks right through it and spills everywhere. That's what sin is. Sin is like holding on to water in a cotton t-shirt. You think, well, I've got this under control. I can handle it. I got this. No, you don't. There's a puddle all over the place because of that sin. Sin does not stay in nice, tidy, organized boxes. It does not act in these nice, predictable ways. Sin is a disaster. Sin is a mess. Sin is corruption. Sin is total devastation in our lives. And you could say it about any sinful activity. And I think the other problem when we talk about getting sin out of our system is when we try to get sin out of our system, we may inadvertently be bringing sin into our system. Because sin is by definition, by nature, habitual and addictive. So you say, well, I'm going to get sin out of my system. I'm going to drink a lot as a young person, get sin out of my system. How do you get sin out of your system? By activating an addictive component of your psychology. How in the world is that getting it out of your system? How does introducing drugs into your system somehow get sin out of your system? I don't know. To me, that just doesn't hold a lot of merit. Now, as we bring our lesson to a close, I want to add one more thing. Let's look at it from the other side, okay? And I use my own life as an example. And at first, it's going to sound like I'm gloating. But don't worry. I'm going to pinch myself here pretty hard in a minute. I was a goody two-shoes as a kid. Always followed the rules. I was my parents' favorite. Middle child, The first one was a rough go. The middle child, we got it right. The second or the third child was always like, well, it's just kind of the leftovers. Middle child, right? I was my parents' favorite. I was a rule follower. Never drank, still haven't. Never had a sip of alcohol in my life. Never smoked a cigarette. Never tried drugs. Behaved myself. Came to sexual matters before marriage. I came home on time, when I was in college, lived with my parents. You're thinking, oh, this guy's getting a lot of credibility now, isn't he? Great. Yep, lived with my parents in college. Home at 9 o'clock, reading a book in the newspaper in the morning, right? I guess I'm golden then, right? I'm good in God's eyes because I've checked off all the boxes. I've done a really good job. I'm not like that prodigal son, that one that got into trouble, the one that went off into the world and followed his impulses and, did whatever the prodigal son did with your father's money. You know what's interesting about the story of the prodigal son, which we did refer to yesterday briefly, but what's interesting about the story of the prodigal son is I think it's a badly named parable. Yes, the prodigal son is the one who captures our attention at the beginning of the story. For he takes his inheritance and he squanders it with worldly living in a faraway land. And he finds himself in this position being envious, even a pig slop, and says, even the hired hands in my father's household don't have to beg for pig scraps. I know what I'll do is I'll go home and I'll beg my father's forgiveness, and maybe my father will let me be a slave in his household, and that's definitely going to be better than what life is right now. So he comes home. His father embraces him, brings him back in, puts a gold ring on his finger, puts a garment on him, and throws a festival for his long-lost son, who he thought was dead, but is now alive. Well, that's not the end of the story, because there was another son as well, an older brother. He was the goody two-shoes. He followed all the rules, came home at curfew, was very respectful, very dutiful in his work. He tells his father, I've been here the whole time, working on your farm. I've never wasted any of your possessions. I never asked for my inheritance. I make a good account of everything that I do. I'm the perfect son, and you've never thrown a party for me. At the end of the story, there in Luke chapter 15, there is only one person in this story who has a sin to repent of. And it isn't the prodigal son. There is only one person at the end of Luke chapter 15 who still needs to make his life right with his father. There is only one person at the end of Luke chapter 15 who still has to figure something out about life. Which, put very simply by Paul in the book of Romans, in chapter 3, verse 23 is, we have all sinned and fall short of God's glory. So yeah, we've talked a lot about sowing our wild oats, and there may be people in this room who have felt very uncomfortable by this conversation because you did sow your wild oats. You look back on your life and you go, I've hurt my body, I've hurt relationships, I've damaged marriages, I've had a reputation in the community that I've had a hard time kicking. Boy, Ryan, you're talking about me here. I'm not the only one, you're not the only one I'm talking to. Because all the way from Donnie drug addict to Charlie Church, and everybody in between needs to listen to the gospel message. That by God's standard, every one of us needs grace. And just because I was a goody two-shoes son who followed all the rules and did everything I was supposed to, that does not make me any better in God's eyes without Jesus than anybody else who's lived that prodigal life. And I am pleading with all of us, if you are the prodigal, you have sown your wild oats, you're living the consequences now, come to God tonight, please. His Son begs you, His Son pleads with you. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. But if you are the other brother, and you've been wearing your nice tie all these years, and the shoes are polished, and you got a well-worn seat in the pew at the church building, but you turn your nose up at the prodigal son, there's something you need to do tonight as well. I encourage you, my brothers, my sisters, my friends, whatever spiritual need you have tonight,